All right, so we're moving on into Chapter 18. Chapter 18 is all about biodiversity and the conservation of biodiversity. Our first module is Module 59, which is the Sixth Mass Extinction. After looking at this module, we're going to be able to explain the global decline in genetic diversity of wild species, look at the global decline in genetic diversity of domesticated species as well, identify the patterns of global decline in species diversity, and explain the values of ecosystems and the global decline of ecosystem function. So this is all about, we learned about biodiversity before. We kind of know why it's important. We're going to exemplify that a little bit more and follow that up with why is it declining different places, why, and couple that with why it's so important. So why should we and how should we conserve it? So we're looking at global declines in the genetic diversity of wild species. We estimate that the world is currently experiencing approximately 50,000 species extinction per year. This is plant, animal, bugs, anything you can think of qualifies as this. The United Nations Convention of Biological Diversity estimates that the current rate of extinction is about 1,000 times higher than during the past 50 years than any other time in human history. So we know that a lot of the stuff that we've been doing recently is theorized to be what's causing a major cause of this decline in biodiversity. Some declines in genetic diversity have natural causes and some are not natural. So why do we want this? We want high genetic diversity because that's going to ensure that a wider range of genotypes is present. And that's going to basically provide protection for those species, as we've kind of discussed earlier. Populations with low genetic diversity are prone to inbreeding depression, which can cause the offspring to have a poor chance of survival and later reproduction. So if you don't have that genetic diversity there, eventually, if the genetic diversity isn't there, the inbreeding depression, what will happen is if two members of a species are too genetically similar, their offspring will not be genetically viable. High genetic diversity improves the probability of surviving future change in the environment as well. For instance, if you think about a tree, maybe there's a disease that affects a certain tree. If you have high genetic diversity, chances are that tree species is going to survive because some of the species will be genetically resistant to that disease. We're also experiencing global declines in genetic diversity of domesticated species, like cows, for instance. There's major concerns about declining genetic variation in the domesticated species of both crops and livestock, so not just animals, on which humans depend. In Europe, half the breeds of livestock that existed in 1900 are now extinct. Half of the breeds of livestock are now extinct because what we do, and 43% of those remaining are currently at serious risk of extinction. Because what happens with livestock is we grow them to be like the perfect size, the perfect growing time, to give us the best quality and quantity and fastest time getting of the meat that we eat. So this leads us to breed for one specific genotype, which has kind of gone in, and this is going to be a big issue, especially if anything ever happens to those livestock. Of the 200 breeds of domesticated animals that have been evaluated in North America, 80% of those breeds are either declining or already facing extinction. So even in America, this is big as well. 80% of the breeds are declining or already facing extinction. The nations of the world have recognized this as a problem, and the problem not only in livestock, but of plants. And so we've seen seed diversity go down because of the same thing. The same thing that has happened with animals has happened with plants. We grow crops and we find the best tasting one and we want everything to be like that. So we only grow one genetic variety of the crop. Well, disease comes in and they become less resilient. And this is a major, major issue. They can only grow. A lot of these species can only grow if we farm them. They won't grow in the wild because of that. So species diversity, because it's declined around the world, we have to label these types of species. We have threatened, near threatened, and least concerned. Threatened is going to be, according to the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, these are species that have a high risk of extinction in the future. So these are going to be the ones that are really close. Near threatened species are going to be ones that are likely to move into the threatened level in the future, and least concern are species that are widespread, abundant, and have lots of diversity. If we look at it, we do, thank goodness, have a majority of least concern in most spaces, but those amount that are threatened that's not a good thing. With 25% of mammals, 41% of amphibians, and 13% of birds being in the threatened area, that this is a big issue globally, because if we lose that genetic diversity of animals and crops and species and domesticated livestock, this could affect humans drastically. So what are the values we get out of ecosystems that we would want to protect this biodiversity? There are two different types of values we look at. We look at intrinsic value. Intrinsic value is like the value it has itself. So it's value independent of any benefit to humans. You would say it has value because it exists. It's like existing value. Like this animal deserves to live because it exists. This species deserves to live because it exists. Same thing with plants, and basically intrinsic value could also be just that basically that they have value because of their existence. An instrumental value, though, is one that is more tangible for us, maybe not even near as worth in some people's estimation, but these are the value of these things, like a crop or a domesticated animal. It's worth as an instrument or a tool that can be used to accomplish a goal for humans. So the worth of lumber or of trees, because they provide lumber and paper and all that kind of stuff for us. The livestock, because they provide the food for us. So when we look at these ecosystem services and these instrumental value, and intrinsic value, we categorize them in 5 different ways. We look at provisions, regulating services, support systems, resilience, and cultural services. A provision is a good that humans use directly. Examples of provisions are, like what I said before, lumber, food, crops, medicinal plants, natural rubber, and furs. Of the top 150 prescription drugs sold in the United States, about 70% come from natural sources. So that's what we're talking about. Like, you can go into the Amazon rainforest. We don't know all the species that are out there. However, a cure for a cancer might be in there. A cure for a disease might be in there. And we don't know because we've made it go extinct because of our logging efforts. So these are any goods, things that we can use directly. A regulating service is a service that an ecosystem provides to regulate environmental conditions, like how oceans, tropical rainforests, they are huge carbon sinks. They absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The more we remove them, the less big that sink is. The more harm we do to the oceans, the more trees we remove, the less they're able to absorb carbon dioxide, and therefore a higher concentration in the air, contributing to climate change. And ecosystems are also important in regulating our nutrient cycles and our hydrologic cycles that we've gone over. Support services. Natural ecosystems provide numerous support services, such as the pollination of food crops by insects. And so the natural ecosystems also support, like, our growing of food. If we decline the bee population, which is a big concern, we're going to stop pollination and stop growing crops. Ecosystems also provide natural pest control services because they provide habitat for predators that prey on agricultural pests. So this is natural pest control. If all of these went away, we have to do synthetic chemical pest control, which obviously that's bad. Resilience. Another service. Resilience depends greatly on the species diversity. We've talked about this before. Here's an example. Several different species may perform similar functions in the ecosystem, but differ in their susceptibility to a disturbance. For instance, if a pollutant kills one plant species that contains nitrogen-fixing bacteria, but not all plant species that contain nitrogen-fixing bacteria, the ecosystem can still continue to do that nitrogen fixation. However, if it's only one genetic species in there, that means the entire species will die and therefore won't be able to provide that service. So resilience is a big service. Cultural services are basically things that aren't technically tangible, but like the beauty of a natural park. The maybe religious things that nature provides. So The awe-inspiring beauty of nature has instrumental value because it provides aesthetic benefit for which people are willing to pay, like going to national parks and things like that. Similarly, scientific funding agencies may award grants to scientists for research that explores biodiversity with no promise of any economic gain, just to preserve the beauty of it and to preserve those animals, even though we know it's not going to provide any instrumental value to us. This is kind of like why they set up national parks and things like that. The decline of ecosystem services. Of 24 different ecosystem functions, 15 have been found to be declining or used at a rate that cannot be sustained. If we want to improve ecosystem functions, we need to improve the fate of species in the ecosystems that provide these services, because that's how they are all interconnected. So of those 24 different ecosystem functions, of all of the functions that we can think of, 15 are declining and used at a rate that cannot be sustained, and that's not good at all. And that's it for this module. We'll be back with module 60, and talk to you later.